Die, heretic! Chaos will fall! We're not with chaos. What? Yeah, we hate that shit. Then you convert with the Xenos. That Zanussi got you questioning your loyalty to the Emperor. 1, we're not aligned with any filthy Xenos. I would bang an Elder, though. 2, we still worship the God Emperor. So you're an independent human faction that is separate from the Imperium and not aligned with Chaos or Xenos. Yeah? Is that even legal? Technically, no. Yikes. Yeah. So, Eldar, huh? Yeah. You? I'm a Votan guy myself. Short stack. Nice. Idionusia superior! What the fuck? Salutations Rangers, General Brotherly 101 back here again. And when was the last time you thought about the Imperium of Man and how really fucked it is? The Imperium is dying. It's in such a bad shape that when Bobby G saw it, he wanted to go right back to being basically dead, with the only thing keeping him alive being thick elf titties. Being his unwavering duty to his people. The Imperium is supposed to be one step away from collapse. Holy Terror is unable to govern worlds properly, with dozens of systems being given over to Space Marine chapters and system governors. The moral degradation and unchecked corruption make any type of reform or change basically impossible, and everyone and their mother wants to kill them. Yet, it doesn't feel like that. The Imperium is supposed to be fractured and decentralized to hell and back, like the Holy Roman Empire, which is neither Holy, Roman, nor an empire, on space steroids. Yet, that seems wrong, as every single rebellion that the Imperium faces is either Chaos or Xenos related. We don't get that sense of breaking at the seams, mainly because there are no human, non-Chaos Xenos aligned factions aside from the Imperium. Or so that's what you thought. As today, I'm going to be covering Warhammer 40k's secret human faction, forgotten by most yet wanted by all. For today, we take a look at the broken politics of the Imperium, the greed of powerful men, the betrayal of rulers, the poor ignorant people caught in between, and the calculating yet cruel machinations of Duke Severus III. Today, we're talking about the Severan Dominate, and how the hell all this began way back when, during the Angevin Crusade. It is the 39th millennium, and the Imperium stands brink on a massive reconquest. Lord Solar Angevin has begun the Angevin Crusade, in an attempt to reclaim countless worlds and systems from the deprivations and degradations of foul, chaotic, and Xenos entities, reclaiming the stars for the Imperium and all of humanity. And one particular chap is doing rather well. That is Duke Severus I. He continues to lead massive explorations against the foe, conquering and battling on countless worlds, slaying tyrants and creatures, everything in between, claiming worlds for the Imperium and for himself, as he possesses a vaunted warrant of trade. Leading each battle personally, he accomplishes many feats, including slaying a giant warp creature, claiming his glass eye said to be worth the ransom of a High Lord of Terror. Indeed, some argue that the Angevin Crusade would not have made such a great progress, if not for Duke Severus himself, for he alone and his forces were able to claim the entirety of the periphery subsector. Indeed, it would appear that a brand new rogue trader dynasty would be founded, one strong and mighty, hailed with glory and grace. Yet, that didn't happen. Couple reasons. Number 1, turns out Duke Severus, kind of a bit of a dick. The only reason why he got his posting there and why he got the warrant of a rogue trader was because 1, he was from an influential family on Terra, 2, he was set to gain a seat in the political senate of Terra because he'd done a lot of backstabbing, blackmailing, political negotiations, and generally the hush-hush no-no bad stuff. So his rivals decided instead of actually dealing with the bastard, they would just yeet him in someone else's direction and hopefully he'd die while conquering a planet. Spoiler alert, he in fact did not die, and was actually pretty good at murdering. I know, the guy who did assassinations is good at murder, but the main reason was because he came into conflict with another venerable name of the Imperium, that being the venerable Saint Drusus, or back then Lord Solar Drusus. You see, when Lord Solar Angevin kicked the bucket, Lord Drusus took over. Drusus and Severus were at odds with each other, because while Severus was power-hungry and seeked only to claim land for himself and his family, Drusus actually continued the Angevin Crusade promptly. He cared about his men and his equipment, and whatever he did it for the best of the Imperium, not for himself. Indeed, he didn't really even care that much about what happened to him or his personal goals, so long as the crusade was always placed first. Where after Severus had conquered the entirety of the periphery subsector, he then stopped all conquests and all of his forces stopped their conquests, specifically to police and govern and secure the holdings, completely ignoring the still ongoing massive war crusade to make sure that his home was nice and dandy. Drusus, on the other hand, continued fighting, so much so that eventually he would die in the field, and the God Emperor, seeing his good old-fashioned niceness and just how much of a swell-up guy he was, then decreed that he was good enough to become a living saint, who would then be resurrected and continue to fight on until the entirety of the Angevan Crusade resulted in the whole sector itself being liberated, and Saint Drusus being hailed by the ecclesiarchy as an eternal saint of the Imperium. Combine all this with the fact that Severus had a nasty habit of not making friends, as he was kind of a dick. He wasn't even the charming sociopath, he was the fuck you I'm right sociopath. Means that whatever he tried to do got sent to hell in a handbasket, as all the generals and leading figures backed Drusus, who saw exactly what Severus was. A power-hungry madman who wanted only family wealth and completely ignored the Imperium. This then led to Severus fighting continuously to get recognition for his house. Eventually he would only end up with one planet, and upon his deathbed he would die bitterly. It was recorded by Imperial scholars they never showed any grace or humility. He never learned to live with his life. He never was happy that he got a full planet. Not only that, but riches and honor to boot. He just wasn't happy. He wanted it all. And as he lay dying, he would tell his one and only son about the true tragedy of Duke Severus and the House of Severus, and how he was a great man brought down by lesser jealous rivals, and how bitter he was over it, and what the true claim of the Severan dynasty was. The entirety of the periphery subsector, for they had bought it in blood. Obviously, a little biased, just a wee bit, don't you know? But this story would be recaled and recounted time after time after time after time. And with each retelling, it got way more crazy and made Duke Severus seem like a very swell guy. And that old Saint Drusus, not so much. I mean, I don't know how the fuck you're going to do that when it's your dad versus a fucking literal living saint, but, you know, to each their own. Until eventually, we'll reach the modern day M41 and Duke Severus the 13th. Speaking of the Duke Severus, the latest and greatest, quote-unquote, heir to the Severan dynasty, Duke Severus the 13th. His story begins in a not too swell of a place. You see, due to all types of political machinations, general bullshitting, and probably being dicks, the Severan dynasty got their holdings reduced to pretty much just a palace and a handful of men. Going from a full planet to that is pretty rough. But Duke Severus was very much like his forefathers, very well gifted, and morally bankrupt to say the least. He then engaged in all forms of political machinations that would make Littlefinger from Game of Thrones hard with envy. You name it, blackmailings, assassinations, cover-ups, secrets, anything you could get, he would weasel his way up to the top, until eventually he would become Lord Subsector of the periphery of the Calixis sector. He ruled over what his family had claimed all those years ago, but it still wasn't his. So he decided to fix that. How did he do that, you may ask? Well, of course, he made allies in very key places, you know, Adeptus Ophites here and there, some trading houses here and there, rogue dynasties and whatnot. Oh yeah, a Dark Elder Cabal. Not even a good Dark Elder Cabal. These were the outcasts of the Dark Elder. The Dark Elder saw these motherfuckers and were like, you guys are pretty fucking shit. We don't want you here. The Dark Elder did that. So to say they were fucked up, they were fucked up. These became known as the Children of the Thorns. So Severus began to discuss with them and he made them a deal. If they were to do as he asked, he would allow them, quote unquote, to raid entire planets of the Imperium for slaves. Due to this, he was able to exert control, as if there was a particular person who needed to be assassinated, send in the Dark Elder assassins. Is there a particular planet that's giving you trouble? Oops, somehow this raiding fleet just magically showed up. Due to this, he was able to build and stockpile munitions, supplies, as well as exert political influences, with his plans eventually to secede from the whole of the periphery subsector as a whole, establishing what he believed to be the true claim of the Severan dynasty. And for all intents and purposes, it looked like it was going pretty well. And it's theorized by many scholars that if nothing had happened, he would have actually been able to secure a well-established and not precarious situation. But this is Warhammer 40k, so yeah, shit always gets fucked up. And there are no better fucker-uppers of fucked up than the Orcs, baby. Mushroom power, motherfucker. As the Calixis sector was absolutely invaded by a massive war, led by none other than war boss Grimtooth Gitslaver. I love Orcs, man. Orcs are just great. This war was of cataclysmic proportions, and descended upon the entirety of the subsector, but particularly the periphery of itself. Duke Severus was absolutely hit with a left hook from this. His worlds began burning, as his PDFs were good, but they wouldn't withstand a war good. Not even guard regiments are that good. Combine that with the fact that the Dark Elder Cabals, who were able to profit handsomely, didn't really give a fuck that humans were being slaughtered by orcs and they still wanted their goodies, which Severus couldn't really give them anymore. He would then go on and ask for aid from the Lord Calix's commander, but said Lord of the Calix's sector told him to rightly fuck off, as when his daughter, the envoy that he sent, would finally reach him, he would simply laugh in her face. Allegedly, this is because Lord Sector Marius Hax and him, that being Duke Severus, share blood ties, and that this is again more interpolitical rivalry between differing houses of the Imperium. Again, we don't know, but it would make sense. Or maybe the bro just didn't like him and told him to get bent. I mean, still fucked because the people are dying, but you know. So what did Severus do? He knuckled down and he turned to the Dark Eldar. He essentially leaned incredibly heavily on their services and began relying on his own people. In combination with the Imperium eventually showing up to take the brunt of the Orc effort out of their hands, he decided that now was time. He tried to grab as many worlds as he could by, quite simply, having the Orcs show up, get the shit kicked in, and then he'll swoop in, conveniently save them from the Orcs, and offer them supplies. Or their leader would mysteriously die at the hands of assassin, but then Severus would come in and set things right. Quite convenient, isn't it? More importantly, he would wait for these planets to teeter on the brink of starvation and revulsion, and then he would show up. And most importantly, he would make the claim that the Imperium had failed them, but he had not. See, Duke Severus understand that the people of the Calixus sector and the periphery subsector in particular, these were descendants of the men and women who had fought during the Angevin Crusade. They were loyal to the God Emperor above all, for their general had been a living saint. He knew that he could never get them to turn against the Emperor, but he knew he could get them to turn against the Administratum and Terra. Thus, he completely removed the Emperor out of the question. Duke Severus was still appointed by the Emperor. The people still followed the Emperor, but those damn old gits at the goddamn Terra, they didn't care. The Administratum didn't care about them. Look, in their time of need when they were beset by orcs of all things, it was Duke Severus, a true servant of the Emperor who came to save them. The Administratum wasn't here. They didn't care. Of course, they didn't know that Duke Severus himself was a goddamn hypocrite and he was using Dark Eldar to do this and that he was actually the most major evil and that the Emperor would actually pretty much hate him, but what they don't know won't hurt them now, will it? And so with the height of all this conflict, people beginning to asking questions as to why all this is happening despite the increased Imperium presence, why worlds were still getting their shit kicked in, Duke Severus decided that the time was right. He, together with 11 planets in the periphery subsector, openly seceded from the Imperium, declaring the birth of a brand new human nation, with Duke Severus at the head. So, that's how the Severan Dominate formed, but how did it go next? The periphery was reaching the height of chaos. No, literally, multiple chaos warbands began deploying upon the scene and causing their own type of mischief. In addition to this, the tenuous truce between the Dark Eldar as well as the Severan Dominate had pretty much fallen out of hand. Whilst they leave alone Severan worlds, he's essentially lost control of them completely. At best, they have a non-aggression pact, and at worst, This then led to what became known as the Spinward Front, or aka Thunderdome Warhammer 40k, because you have the Severan Dominate, the Imperium of Man, an Orc War, a Dark Eldar Cabal, and several Chaos Warbands, all fighting for this one little subsector. And that's where we find the Severan Dominate. You see, the Dominant is able to hold off against all these types of foes, but that's because they're all fighting each other together with the Dominant. The Dominant is only 11 planets, and it's pretty rough for them, considering all the forces that they have arrayed against them. But Duke Severus is many things, but he's not dumb. Whilst he wanted to do this way later than what was forced upon him, and whilst he did lose a lot to the Orcs, he still has enough to make a concerted effort. It's a classic case of when the Imperium and the Orcs are fighting, he'll be defending against Chaos as well as the Dark Eldar. When the Dark Eldar and Chaos are fighting, he'll be defending against the Orcs and the Imperium. And when all of them are fighting each other, he'll push out on his own. But to truly understand the situation, we gotta talk about the big three: economy, diplomacy, and military. Economy first and foremost. The economy of the Severan Dominant is pretty much just that of the Imperium. They still use thrones as a major currency. All the systems of the Administratum are still well in place. As leading up to the succession, Duke Severus ensured that all the Administratum as well as Mechanicum individuals were loyal to him rather than the Mechanicus or Administratum as a whole. And if they weren't, well then he just had a Dark Elder Witch show up and show them what that tongue do. What do it do? Bad things. Very bad things. Yet, the economy and administration is actually better than the Imperium as a whole, ironically, as due to its limited size, Duke Severus can exert far much more control over it, as well as, since they are all loyal to him, corruption in the Severan Dominant is pretty much unheard of, unless you're in the top echelon, because the top echelon actually knows what the fuck is going on. Spoiler alert, it's pretty bad. Whilst the 11 worlds of the Dominant can't hold a candle to the however million of the Imperium, they are more than enough to keep it afloat for now. And considering that Duke Severus has had time to build up their worlds, especially the capital world of Caracalla, means that the Dominant is able to do much more than it should. Its economy is helped in a large part due to its trade, which then leads us to diplomacy. Whilst the Imperium doesn't recognize the Dominant in any meaningful form, other factions surprisingly seem to have. As I mentioned before, the Dark Eldar have their pseudo non-aggression pact with them, Chaos Warbands acknowledge that attacking the Dominant is not the same as attacking the Imperium, and vice versa, and the Orcs realize that there are Umis in red and there are Umis in green. But more importantly, there are many high-ranking officials in the Calixis subsector who do acknowledge Duke Severus, including many high-ranking Abatais, which Duke Severus had as allies beforehand. These officials make interacting with the Dominant pretty much viable, as there are indeed some channels, albeit illegal channels, for the Imperium to communicate with them. In addition, while the Imperium's stance is pretty much kill these motherfuckers, many of the soldiers on the ground and officers come to realize that whilst they are indeed rebels, they're not the main problem, recognizing that an Orc War, Chaos Warband, as well as a Dark Eldar raid are far more important to deal with than the troops of Duke Severus. This isn't to say that they like them by any stretch of a means, but it's a case of they are the least important thing in this area. But the two main major lifelines for the Dominant are its alliance with two rogue trader houses. Two unnamed rogue trader houses have continued to interact with the Severan Dominant, claiming that whilst they are still loyal servants to the Imperium, the Severan Dominant is technically not part of the Imperium, and since they're allowed to do whatever the hell they want outside of the Imperium, well, technically, they're allowed to trade with them. This has opened corridors into the Calixis sector, as well as the neighboring sectors. This means that the Severan Dominant, already pretty self-sufficient, knowing of course that they were going to be succeeding and on their own, have a vital trade line, as any shortcomings caused by battles, dire circumstances, or just being too damn small. Two whole rogue trader houses worth of supplies and trade means a lot of coin and a lot of food. And remember, the Severan Dominant is pretty much the Imperium, but not part of the Imperium, meaning that trading with them and dealing with them is simple and easy. And for rogue traders who just want some coin, it's not a hard stretch. And besides, it's going to be pretty easy for them to tell the random chap from 3 sectors over that the guns and ammo and food they're giving to them are going to directly Imperial people, when they still use Imperial seals, Imperial identity tags, and Imperial methods. And that then brings me on to their military. The Severan Dominant's military is pretty much just the Imperium's copied paste for paste. The Severan Dominant are essentially a guard regiment. Their units are equipped with standard arms and armor, flak armor for their basic troopers, laser rifles, some shotguns and autoguns for close combat units, gladius because of course gladius Roma themed, and they have their unique shock troopers, which sadly do not have a Romanized name to them. Come on, GW, big miss. Armed with Hellshot lasguns, power weapons, carapace armor, and deployed as shock troopers or, more often, assassinations or high-profile missions that require depth touch. The elite of the Severan Dominant are basically just stormtroopers. The Severan Dominant has a massive military for 11 worlds, but that's the thing, it's massive for 11 worlds. It's still jack and shit compared to the Imperium. But again, the Dominant is pretty much the Imperium just minus terror. When soldiers of the Imperium encounter them, they don't necessarily encounter vile chaotic signs or evil Xenos nonsense. It's pretty much like a random normal Imperial world. You see, the people fighting the Dominant don't see themselves as renegades. They don't see them against the will of the God Emperor. They don't bow to Chaos or to Xenos. They are just sick and tired of the goddamn people on Terra telling them what to do when they were getting their asses kicked in by Orcs and Dark Eldar. Nobody did nothing. In essence, they're just as much victims as everyone else's. You see, Duke Severus and his ducal legates, those being his elite top lieutenants who he uses as basically commissars, except their first priority is diplomacy, as well as smooth talking. And if all that finishes, then they pull out the bolt pistol to the head. They're essentially commissars, but super charming and really sly and slick. They are the only people who truly know what's going on with the Dark Eldar and the actual origins of the Severan dynasty. Normal everyday chap, he doesn't know that. And indeed, the average guardsman doesn't really know either. He's told that they're renegades and that they're evil and bad, but when he rocks up and that he sees that this planet is pretty much just his and that these folks are praying to the God Emperor and there's a priest with them, there's a pseudo-commissar obviously it's like, okay, what the fuck? I mean, he does what he's told because he's ordered to. Just why the Severan Dominant does what they do because they are ordered to. No one really knows what is happening. And when they actually meet each other, they realize that A plus B don't equal C. But again, the Imperium is way too stubborn, way too bloated, and way too damn stupid to stop and ask questions and just murder, death, kill everything. And the Severan Dominant, they are defending their home. Not just from the Imperium, but from Xenos, Orcs, and Heretics. All in all, the Severan Dominant regiments are pretty good, but they only have one slight issue. They're all basically fresh out the womb. There were no really major veterans of the Severan Dominant Guard. During the battle for the Orcs, they were all fresh and they got wiped out. While there may be a few veterans from there, they're not exactly the elite combat units. Which means that it's pretty uncertain for how the story progresses. I mean, will the Severan Dominant Guard stand or will they break? Only time will tell. Time which we don't really have. Yeah. Time for, the big rocks in the room. So, the Severan Dominant. They're a pretty cool faction because, as I said, they're the Imperium, but not part of the Imperium. They're not aligned with Chaos or Xenos as any faction, and there's a whole lot of political maneuvering and intrigue going on combined with good old-fashioned grindy warfare of Warhammer 40k. So that begs the question, why have we never heard of these guys? Why are they so bloody rare? Well, that's because, legal shenaniganery. You see, the story for the Severan Dominant were in a group of TTRPG guides/novels. These were created by a Fantasy Flight Games. This is a company that worked in a partnership with Games Workshop. However, as of February 28, 2017, Fantasy Flight Games and Games Workshop went their separate ways. Allegedly, YouTube and GW please, the reason for this happening is because the parent company of Fantasy Flight Games was bought out. According to GW, this violated their terms of service. Fantasy Flight Games or otherwise, and that there was a falling out. Again, allegedly. I say allegedly because, like, there's not really that much information about it except for this statement by Fantasy Flight Games. Which means that for all intents and purposes, the Severan Dominant is dead as a faction. Because GW has a terrible fucking habit of starting amazing storylines and never finishing them or giving them a satisfying result. And instead of actually looking into finishing stuff that people want to get finished, they'll start up something new and forget it even existed. For all intents and purposes, this storyline is dead. So is the Severan Dominant, and we're never going to see them again. The only way this is going to work is if a fan creates a fan project about the Severan Dominant and explores how they are going to manipulate and change and be molded into the Spinward front. But then, of course, that brings up with the problematic issues of GW's past issues with fans making original fan content based in Warhammer 40k, and yeah, I don't blame them. So the sad reality is that the Severan Dominant doesn't exist as a faction and will be forever a question of what if. But to me, it seems like a goddamn shame for something like the Severan Dominant to die. Not because the faction is particularly unique or anything in terms of aesthetics, they basically Rome 2.0, I mean the Severan Dynasty doi, but it's what they represent as a concept. They are a non-Xenos, non-Chaos faction that is not aligned with the Imperium. It shows that the Imperium is breaking at the seams. Tangible proof and evidence that we have that things are going pretty bad for the Imperium of Man. Whilst I doubt that GW will ever resurrect the Dominant, I would really love it if they gave us something different. If they gave us something similar to this. I'm sick and tired of every time there's a human uprising, oh, Lamau, it's secretly Chaos, it's secretly Xenos. Give us something that is incredibly unique. But hey, there's a lot going on with 40k, and GW doesn't really have this as their priority. What GW does have their priority, aside from bloody making money, I don't know. But I mean, there are companies, so it's unfortunate, but at least we still have a little bit to go on. So the worlds of the Severan Dominant. See, originally the capital was one known as Kolth. However, it then became too tenuous as there was a three-pronged civil war between the Imperial forces, the Severan Dominant, as well as the Orcish forces, each one claiming a third of the planet, kind of like an Armageddon-style deal. So the capital was then moved to Caracalla. Caracalla is the capital of the Severan Dominant, as it is surrounded by several gas giants, which make resources incredibly important in regards to warp travel, meaning that it's incredibly lucrative and essentially the economic capital of the Severan Dominant, rivaled only by Stallithia, the mining world. However, this is to say that it's not that good. Every single world in the Severan Dominant is beset by some type of force, whether it be Imperium, Orcs, Xenos, or anything in between. Thus, all of them are heavily barricaded, defended, and self-sufficient. Caracalla has it better than most places, but still you gotta be careful of the Imperium launching an assault, the Eldar launching a raid, or the Orcs having good war. Thrax and Maessa are frontier worlds. These are worlds worlds that were relatively settled, and they have borne the brunt of the orcish invasions. They're a bit more stable, surprisingly, as they only have to deal with orcs that much, but it's still not ideal and they have to make most of their situations. They're not as established as the other worlds, which means that the people there themselves are even more self-reliant than the normal people of the Severan Dominate. But they provide hardy scouts as well as engineers used to roughing and tumbling it out. We then have Orbiana, Feral World. The Feral World doesn't offer much to the Severan Dominant except for manpower. The recruits of the Feral World are already used to rough and tumble, harsh living, incredibly savage and vicious. Far more when the orcs and other elements showed up. It's become incredibly resilient, as the main forces of the Severan Dominant Guard are drawn from here, as they are already hardy and warlike. You train them how to write and how to speak English, and in conjunction how to field strip a lasgun. Good as new. You got yourself a solid soldier. Lucius is a war world, beset by orcs. This is essentially the Bastion world of the Severan Dominant. Whilst the frontier worlds represent the odd sporadic lines and raids with the orcs, this is the primary entrance point that the Orc War has into the Severan Dominant. Thus, it has been fortified to hell and back, with Duke Severus himself vowing the orc shall cross this line. The fortress is heavily industrialized, and very much takes up a medieval theme. As prior to the Severan Dominant claiming the planet, it was in the Iron Age. It's only been a couple of years, but a forced change in industrialization being dragged in the 41st millennium has left half of the population reeling from the drastic changes, with the other half seemingly adapting and thriving upon it. Whilst the Feral World is where they get the majority of their recruits, when it comes to the defense against the orcs, Lucius is where the Severan Dominant looks for its brave men and women. We then have Kotosis. Kotosis is an ice world, and it is the imperial version of what Lucius is to the orcs. Again, heavily fortified to hell and back, it is the primary entrance point for the Imperium to get into the Severan Dominant. Much like Lucius, if the Imperium is able to break Kotius, they're able to have free reign into the core of the Severan Dominant of itself. And instead of being able to launch raids, they're able to launch full-scale invasions. Fighting is fierce here, but it's not as fierce as the other parts of the world, as again, it's mostly human-on-human combat. And where there is humans, there will be a humanity, even if only for a little bit and very briefly. We then have Omsworld. Omsworld is a hive world, and it's the main population center for the Severan Dominant. It's your standard hive world, overpopulated to hell and back, lots of slums, lots of cities, very high fancy stuff, and a toxic atmosphere that will give Armageddon a run for its money. We then have Kuya Vale. Kuya Vale is a rainforest world. It, generally speaking, was the paradise of the Severan Dominant, if such a thing could even be called so. Lush tropical forests, shining with an outer beauty that hide the lots of very deadliest critters within. It's not like Catachan, I mean nothing's like Catachan, but still, you don't exactly want to be caught out there for long periods of time. Also, it has dragons, or sorry, a Drakon. These are incredibly territorial and incredibly savage, meaning that large-scale population of the planet is virtually impossible, with only a few military outposts far away from any form of Drakon territory are stationed there. Though, the Severan Dominant has some rumor to experimenting in creating a unit of these guys, as with their scales being able to withstand even blast cannon fire, allegedly, and being able to rip apart battle tanks in two, allegedly, having a unit of these guys would prove very, very, very beneficial. Syria is the Grave World. Quite simple, it has been blasted to hell and back throughout the years, even before the beginning of the conflict, reducing it to pretty much lifeless and valuabless. And then finally, we have Stalynthia. Stalynthia is arguably the most valuable asset that the Severan Dominant has, because it is a mining world. Not only a mining world, but a rich mining world. As while it can't produce enough food to feed the planet, it can't produce enough metal to service the entirety of the Severan Dominant, and enough precious materials to be extremely valuable in trade. This is essentially the lifeblood of the Severan Dominant, as it gives it the ability to fight off the Imperium and all attackers, as well as the wealth needed to train more troops and to gain more allies. Needless to say, this has been a prime target for people trying to fight and destroy the Severan Dominant, or looking to get lucky, as a mining world is one hell of a prize. But thankfully for the Severan Dominant, its unique strategic position, it's not in range of any one particular entity or group, and the fact that it is fortified to hell and back, even more so than the goddamn capital, means that this is probably going to be one of the last worlds that the Severan Dominant will lose, if ever. But to end off this video, I want to have a little section just with a bit of a what if. If GW for some miraculous reason decides to revive the Severan Dominant, how would they fit in modern 40k? So, two outcomes. Outcome number one, the Citrix Maledictum happens, and the Severan Dominant is overrun by chaos and just fucking dies. Maybe the whole Spinwood front fucking dies, because the entirety of the Calixis sector, and thus the Spinwood front, is in the Imperium Nihilus. So they get overrun by chaos, and Lamau, they're dead. This is most likely what GW will do if they ever mention the Severan Dominant ever again. Big Sag, but it's the most realistic option. But this is Warhammer 40k, so fuck realism, I want to do something spicy. The other option, my preferred option, they live and they continue their existence. You see, Chaos is empowered incredibly good, and thus the Imperium has to back off and focus on Chaos. The Orcs continue fighting because Orcs and the Dark Eldar now have other Imperial worlds to raid and continue satisfying their own decadent, disastrous lust upon something that isn't the Severan Dominate. Meaning, the Dominant has breathing room. As Chaos is focused on the Imperium, and the Imperium is focused on Chaos, the Severan Dominate begins expanding, and they begin claiming worlds of the Imperium. They establish themselves fully as an entity, and best case scenario, they claim the entirety of the periphery subsector and become a mini kingdom of itself, claiming vast swaths of Imperial gear as well as manpower, whatever was left behind. Hell, maybe even a few regiments turn to them, seeing that the Imperium basically left them for however long it took for Guilliman to reach them. And when Guilliman does reach them, he could in fact do the "you are traitors to the Imperium" and make them die, or he could do the "right, you're independent, but you have to ally with us, or we demand you be a vassal rogue trader." Guilliman is pragmatic, and I don't see him wanting to fight a bunch of humans who still are nominally non-chaotic, non-Xenos aligned, and maybe focus on the Dark Eldar, Chaos, or Orcs instead. We could get a proper faction of the Severan Dominate, eventually evolving and molding. They still have the Imperial roots, still using terms in the Guard and the formation and structure of regiments, but perhaps they gain more Dark Eldar technology, perhaps they lean into the Orcs, perhaps they lean into their trading aspects, developing their own unique culture and arms and technology. We see a slow emergence of a hybridization between the base roots of the Imperium, yet their brand new own thing. And moreover, what the hell happens to the Dominant? Because if anyone finds out what Duke Severus did to establish a Dominant, his ass is grass. Him and all his ducal legates. So we could get a civil war within the Severan Dominant. There could be a split. The Severan Dominant establishing himself as the Severan Empire, and perhaps the Periphery Republic. Again, Roman themes, so I'm trying again, maybe a little bit of this and that. It just feels alive. That with everything going on in the Imperium, this little slice of the world that once was 11 planets now became 22 or 30, was then split into 14 and 15 between two separate states, and there's a war ongoing, and eventually maybe they get reunited under a new banner. Do they rejoin the Imperium to become a rogue trader dynasty? It's one of those things where it just brings out the glory of the Imperium. And Warhammer 40k, you have the Imperium faction, you have the Orc faction, you have the Xenos faction, you have the Chaos faction, you then have the evil humans who are not the Imperium for a change, and you could have the Republicans who are the good peeps trying to get their shit sorted out in 40k. It could be a great series of books. And looking into it, I may throw some ideas around with my boys and see, maybe I'll write some stuff with Severan Dominate. I'm really liking the idea of a non-human Imperium faction that isn't aligned with Chaos or Xenos. The Severan Dominate is a perfect example of what we should have more, and where I believe Warhammer 40k should go for in regards to the Imperium. It's the Imperium in all but name. It's a breakaway state. Exactly as it should be. There's no Chaos, there's no Xenos, there's no malignant nothings. It's just a greedy man wanting power and doesn't care who he has to stab to get in the way of it. Tale as old as time. It's a story of men and women on both sides of a conflict fighting for they don't really know why. Except for in the moment, that guy's trying to kill you and hurt your family. So you gotta kill him. It's a story of greed, of hubris, of avarice, of a broken power system that should have nipped this in the bud 2,000 years earlier. Because of the lazy, bureaucratic, corrupted mess of it all, millions now have to suffer through the incompetence of a few back in the day. It has endless possibilities for what could happen, and perched on the perfect place for beautiful stories, fighting within itself and without, beset by Orcs, Dark Eldar, Chaos, and the Imperium. It is the perfect example of what a breakaway state is. And, in my opinion, what the Imperium should strive to have more of. I personally love the idea. Again, not too chuffed that they're Roman themed. I know, surprising, probably not looking at Roman themed, but we already have the Ultramarines. I would prefer something a little bit more different. Like, if you really want to stab at the whole Rome thing, make them like a Romano-Gaul or a Romano-Britain or a Mauro-Romano kingdom. Base them off one of the actual successor Roman states of a Western Roman Empire that existed. But maybe they'll evolve into that if continued. Maybe that was a plan, but sadly we'll never know. But ladies and gentlemen, that has been the Severan Dominate. I absolutely adore these guys, and comment down below, what are your ideas for the Severan Dominate? Do you think they're just going to be wiped off the slate clean? Do you want them to change? Do you want them to keep the Roman themes? Do you want them to change up and do a different thing? How do you think Gillidan would interact with them? But I want to thank you all so very much for watching. It does mean the world to me, and I want to thank you guys for supporting me, and a special big thank you to Mr. Thomas Moslans. Thank you, sir, for your continued support of this wonderful channel. If you guys want to help out the channel and gain access to some awesome benefits, including getting these videos a full day early, as well as the full unedited, complete uncut versions of the interviews I had with Mr. Arthur Bones as well as Pancras No Work. You can sign up for the memberships. You get to help out your boy and you gain some awesome goodness in the process. But remember, you don't got to. This stuff will always be free, and I will always love you just simply for watching all the way to the end. Mwah! But that's all from your boy over here. Make sure to click on all the links down below. I love you, you know I do. And I have been the General Bradley 101. You have been beautiful, awesome, and amazing people. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss, Rangers! Just once I'd like to find something goddamn cool and unique in Warhammer 40k without realizing once looking into it that GW for whatever reason has basically abandoned it and is never going to touch it and it's basically dead. God damn it, why does this always happen?